The entitled CEO believed his wealth made him untouchable, but when he slapped a royal guard for not treating him like royalty, the response shattered his ego and his illusion of power. Here's what happened. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Also, make sure to check out our second channel, Guard Patrol, linked in the pinned comments, because we upload daily at the same time on both channels. So subscribe to both and never miss a Power AUL story, The Gleaming Silver. Bentley Malison rolled to a stop at the edge of the public access area near Buckingham Palace, its custom engine humming with quiet power. Before falling silent, the chauffeur rushed to open the rear door, but Victor Harrington was already pushing it open himself, impatient. "As always, you're too slow, Davis," he muttered, stepping onto the pavement with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having the world adjust to his pace rather than the other way around. Victor's tailest of all, our suit in a shade of blue so dark it was almost black, contrasted sharply with his silver hair and steel-gray eyes at 53. He had the lean physique of someone who considered physical fitness another asset to be maintained, like his stock portfolio. His watch, a limited-edition Patek Philippe, that cost more than most Londoners earned in a year, glinted in the afternoon sunlight as he checked the time. An irritating flick of his wrists were already behind schedule. He said to no one in particular, though his executive assistant Margaret, we immediately began tapping notes into her tablet. "The meeting with Parliament members is in 2 hours. This test nonsense should have been dealt with yesterday." Margaret nodded efficiently. "I did suggest that, sir, but you insisted on seeing the palace personally before discussing the tech summit venue options." Victor's jaw tightened. He wasn't accustomed to being reminded of his own decisions, especially when they proved inconvenient. "Well, it shouldn't take long. These ceremonial relics are all the same impressive from a distance, impractical up close." He gestured dismissively at the palace. "Like everything else in this country, trading on past glory while the future happens elsewhere." As they moved toward the gates, tourists parted instinctively before them, perhaps sensing the aura of authority that Victor had spent decades cultivating, or simply responding to the purposeful stride of a man who clearly considered himself more important than anyone around him. Harrington Technologies is doing these people a favor by considering London for our new European headquarters. Victor continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "The least they could do is roll out the red carpet, and Singapore government officials personally escorted me through their historical sites." A young couple with a guidebook stepped aside as Victor approached a woman, pulling her partner back slightly as if avoiding collision with a force of nature Victor didn't notice in his world. This was simply the natural order of things. His gaze settled on a royal guard standing at his post, perfectly still in his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap. Staff Sergeant James Collins maintained his forward stare, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance. With the discipline earned through years of military service, his ceremonial rifle was held at precisely the correct angle, his posture textbook perfect despite having already been on duty for hours. "Now, there's something you don't see in Silicon Valley," Victor remarked, his tone somewhere between amusement and contempt. "Living statues playing dress-up for the tourists." He paused, studying the guard with the same analytical eye used when assessing companies for acquisition. "Archaic, inefficient, serving no practical purpose. Yet they insist on maintaining tradition. It's exactly what's holding this country back." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "So the royal guards are actually elite soldiers with excellent costume designers, clearly." Victor cut her off. "Tell me, Margaret, what actual function does a man standing perfectly still serve in today's world? It's theater, nothing more." He straightened his already immaculate tie, and not particularly impressive theater. At that, a family with 2 young children moved past, the father quietly explaining to his wide-eyed daughter the significance of the guards and their historical role. Victor rolled his eyes at this, making a point of checking his watch again. "Time is money, Margaret, and mine is worth more than most." His voice had taken on the edge that his employees recognized as dangerous territory. "Let's see if these famous guards understand how the modern world works, or if they need a lesson in the new hierarchy of power." With that, Victor began walking directly toward Staff Sergeant Collins' path, as straight and unyielding as his ambition had been throughout his meteoric rise to becoming one of the tech world's most feared and respected CEOs. Behind him, Margaret exchanged worried glances with Davis, both recognizing the signs of their employer's most dangerous mood, the calm confidence of a man accustomed to bending the world to his will, and the growing irritation of one unaccustomed to resistance. "Impressive dedication to staying motionless," Victor remarked, stopping just within what most would consider guards' personal space. "I employ people who develop robots with less rigid programming." He studied the guards' face with clinical interest, noting the disciplined lack of Reaction, though, I must say the human touch adds a certain quaintness to Performance Staff Sergeant Collins remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward, as they had been throughout his watch years of military discipline, held firm against Victor's intrusion, his training having prepared him for far worse than the proximity of an entitled civilian. "You know who I am, don't you?" Victor's voice carried the casual certainty of a man unused to being unrecognized. Victor Harrington, founder and CEO of Harrington Technologies. He paused, as if waiting for the name to register. When no reaction came, his smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "My company revolutionized quantum computing. Our market valuation exceeded the GDP of several European nations." Last quarter, a small group of tourists had paused their photography, sensing the brewing confrontation. Among them stood an elderly man wearing a regimental tie, his bearing suggesting military background. Despite his age, he watched the interaction with growing concern, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in what appeared to be an old habit of self-restraint. "I'm speaking to you, Soldier." Victor continued, his tone shifting slightly to corporate smoothness, acquiring an edge. "Basic courtesy would suggest acknowledging someone of my standing in the business world. We call that networking." He chuckled at his own wit, glancing back at Margaret, who managed a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. The guard remained immobile, his discipline unwavering despite Victor's increasing proximity. The medals on his chest, real honors earned in combat zones, caught the afternoon light, telling stories of service and sacrifice that Victor couldn't begin to comprehend. "Fascinating," Victor said, circling the guard like a predator assessing potential prey. "In my company, this kind of rigidity will be grounds for immediate replacement. Adaptability is essential in the modern world." Standing still while everything changes around you, he made a dismissive gesture. "That's how dinosaurs became extinct." A young mother nearby pulled her curious children back a few steps, something in Victor's demeanor triggering a protective instinct. Her husband frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the CEO's behavior, but uncertain how to intervene. Sir, Margaret ventured cautiously, "Perhaps we should continue our tour of the Parliament. Members will be expecting." "They'll wait." Victor cut her off without taking his eyes off the guard. "I find this fascinating. Here we have a perfect example of why Britain's global influence has waned. Clinging to outdated traditions instead of embracing innovation." He raised his voice slightly, now clearly performing for the growing audience. "While my engineers are developing AI systems that will reshape civilization, the Crown's finest are perfecting the art of standing still." The elderly man with the regimental tie took a half step forward, then seemed to think better direct intervention. Instead, he moved to stand where Staff Sergeant Collins could see him in his peripheral vision, offering a subtle presence of solidarity that veterans would recognize, but civilians might miss. "You know what impresses me about your famous discipline," Victor continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone. "Absolutely nothing in the real world. My world results matter, impact matters. Standing guard over a mostly symbolic monarchy, what measurable value does that create?" He leaned closer to his expensive cologne, now detectable in the guard space. "My quarterly dividend payments to shareholders create more value in a day than this entire ceremonial display produces in a year." A few tourists had begun to move away, uncomfortable with the growing tension. Others remained, phones lowered, witnessing something they hadn't expected in their visit to the historic site. "Does the palace pay you well for this performance?" Victor inquired, his voice dripping with condescension. "Because I doubt it's competitive with private sector compensation. My executive chauffeur likely earns more than you do, and he's permitted to move when addressed." He gestured toward Davis, who looked away in evident embarrassment. The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, giving no indication that Victor's words had any impact, but there was something in his bearing, a subtle intensity that those with combat experience might recognize as controlled readiness rather than passive endurance. This silence, Victor gestured expansively, this precious tradition you're maintaining. It's exactly why empires fall, refusing to evolve, to adapt, to recognize changing power structures. His voice had taken on the same tone he used when delivering keynote speeches at industry events. "The new aristocracy isn't about bloodlines or historical accidents of birth. It's about innovation, disruption, creating actual value." People like me, the elderly veteran's face had hardened, the lines around his eyes deepening with each of Victor's pronouncements. Nearby, a family from Manchester exchanged uncomfortable glances, the father whispering something about typical London business types to his wife. Victor checked his watch again, the performance more for effect than actual time management. "I'll make you a proposition." Guard acknowledged me properly. "A simple good afternoon, Mr. Harrington, would suffice, and I'll make a generous donation to whatever veterans charity You prefer his smile was all teeth and no warmth considered incentive-based compensation. Something your employer clearly hasn't introduced you to. The guard's continued silence seemed to finally crack something. In Victor's composed facade, a flush of color touched his. Cheeks nearly imperceptible except to those who knew him well. Margaret took an instinctive step backward, recognizing the warning sign from previous corporate confrontations. Let me be perfectly clear. Victor's voice dropped to the quiet, dangerous tone that had preceded the demolition of competing companies. I am not accustomed to being ignored, particularly not by someone whose entire purpose is ceremonial window dressing. For a fading institution, Victor's jaw tightened as the guards continued. Silence glared at his carefully maintained composure. 15 years of business journalist hanging on his every word, politicians ting his favorite competitors, fearing his market moves, yet this uniformed man stood immune to his influence. Perhaps we're approaching this incorrectly, Victor said, his voice dropping to the dangerous tone his executives knew preceded corporate executions. Let me explain the real hierarchy here. My company's quarterly tax payment funds more of this country's budget than this entire royal spectacle generates in tourism revenue. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting Victor's shadow across the guard's polished boot. Staff Sergeant Collins remained motionless, though those closest to him might have noticed a subtle tension in his bearing, not fear, but the coiled readiness of a soldier who'd faced actual threats in combat zones. 2 tours in Helmand Province, the elderly veteran murmured to a nearby tourist who'd questioned the guards. Compose your Silver Star recipient, these aren't costume players, they're elite soldiers on ceremonial duty. Victor caught the comment and turned sharply elite at what exactly standing still while the real world passes him by. His laugh was cutting in the time he's been practicing statue imitations. My company has filed 63 patents that will reshape global communications. He turned back to the guard, emboldened by his audience. You know what separates us? I built my empire, created it from nothing but intelligence, and will your position handed to you by an institution that peaked centuries ago and has been coasting on tradition ever since. Margaret took a cautious step forward. Mr. Harrington, we should really not now, Victor snapped, never taking his eyes off the guard. I'm conducting an experiment in institutional responsiveness. He moved closer to Collins, deliberately invading the buffer space most tourists instinctively respected. I'm curious about the limits of this famous discipline. What exactly would it take for you to acknowledge reality that your ceremonial role is theater for tourists, while men like me shape the world? Your retire into Davis, who had maintained a respectful distance, now looked actively uncomfortable. Even in Victor's demanding corporate culture, this public confrontation crossed lines of basic decency. I've negotiated with prime ministers and presidents. Victor continued, his voice rising slightly, closed deals that altered global markets, yet you stand there pretending I'm invisible. He circled Collins again, his movements becoming more predatory. That uniform represents a system. I've transcended modern power isn't about tradition or ceremony. It's about innovation, capital, and influence. The veteran had moved closer, joined now by another older gentleman, wearing a subtle but recognizable military association pin. Exchanged knowing glances, the kind shared by men who recognize brewing trouble from experience in Afghanistan. Victor continued, catching sight of the medals on Collins's chest. You followed orders from above, but let me educate you on something. Sold to the hierarchy has shifted. The crown may sign your paycheck, but my tax contributions fund the government that pays for this entire operation. His finger jabbed toward the palace, which makes me effectively your employer. A family hurried their children away, the parents exchanging troubled glances. Other tourists had stopped taking photographs, entirely sensing they were witnessing something unpleasant rather than the ceremonial change of the guard. They'd expected. Victor's face had flushed slightly, the only visible sign that the guard's continued non-response was affecting him more than he cared to admit. His next words emerged, Ed, with deadly quietness. Perhaps you don't understand who you're dealing with. I've destroyed companies larger than this country's defense budget, ended careers of people far more consequential than a ceremonial guardsman. With one phone call, I can ensure your commanding officer faces questions about the conduct and relevance of this entire operation. Margaret's tablet slipped slightly in her grip, her professional mask cracking to reveal genuine concern. She'd seen that expression before at board meetings, where Victor had systematically dismantled opposition during hostile takeovers, where executives suddenly found themselves unemployable. But Staff Sergeant Collins stood unmoved, his eyes fixed forward with the same discipline that had kept him alive during firefights in distant provinces. This is your final opportunity, Victor stated, his voice now stripped of its corporate polish, revealing a raw entitlement beneath. Acknowledge me properly and This becomes an amusing anecdote about cultural differences continue this disrespect, and I'll make it my personal mission to question the funding for this entire ceremonial charade in my meeting with Parliament. The crowd had grown drawn by the palpable tension. Children were ushered away by concerned parents, while others watched with uncomfortable fascination, like witnesses a car crash. In slow motion, Staff Sergeant Collins remained perfectly still, his training holding firm against what was merely another test of discipline in his peripheral vision. The elderly veteran gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Soldier to soldier across generations, I've broken monopolies. Victor continued his composure, fracturing further dismantled regulatory frameworks that were considered untouchable, brought technology giants to their knees in negotiations. Each statement emerged sharper than the last, like physical jabs that met only air, yet you stand there in your costume, pretending centuries of tradition outweigh the reality of modern power. Margaret had stopped pretending to take notes. Her tablet now clutched to her chest like a shield. Davis had retreated several paces, instinctively distancing himself from what was unfolding. Mr. Harrington, Margaret attempted once more. The parliamentary committee will wait. Victor snapped, his voice cutting through the courtyard with enough force that several tourists flinched. I'm dealing with something more fundamental here. He turned back to Collins, stepping close enough that the guard could feel his breath. This is about respect, about recognizing the actual power structures of the 21st century, not clinging to costume party representations of the past. The elderly veteran had been joined by a third man, this one younger, but with the unmistakable bearing of military service. They formed a subtle line of solidarity, not interfering, but clearly monitoring the situation with professional assessment. Let me make something perfectly clear. Victor's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Your position exists at the pleasure of the public. My company's technologies are essential to national security, economic growth, and global communications. I am not someone to be ignored by a ceremonial relic. Collins's eyes remained fixed forward, but there was something in the set of his jaw now, not fear, not anger, but the kind of resolute determination that had carried him through firefights where the odds seemed impossible. This uniformed Victor continued, flicking the guard's scarlet tunic with his finger. Represents a past that's quickly becoming irrelevant. My company represents a future, and in that future, men like you will understand their proper place in the hierarchy. The flick against the uniform created a collective intake of breath from those close enough to see it. Physical contact with the guard was explicitly forbidden. Even the most clueless tourists rarely crossed. Something shifted in Victor's expression, a sudden dangerous crystallization of frustration, entitlement, and rage. His face flushed darker, the veins in his temple becoming visible as decades of unchallenged authority collided with this immovable symbol of duty. You will acknowledge me, hissed, all pretense of civility evaporating. I am Victor Harrington. I don't get ignored by costume functionaries. Victor's right hand rose in one swift, violent motion. His manicured fingers curled slightly as his palm flew through the air, gathering momentum. The afternoon sun caught his platinum wedding band as his arm reached its apex, then descended with terrible purpose. The crack of flesh meeting flesh exploded across the courtyard like a gunshot. Victor's open palm connected with Staff Sergeant Collins's face with such force that spill flew from the corner of the guard's mouth. The guard's head snapped sideways on the impact, the bare skin cap tilting precariously as the scarlet collar of his uniform momentarily lost its perfect alignment. The slap echoed off the ancient stones hanging in the air like thunder. After lightning, a crimson hand print immediately bloomed across Collins's cheek, the outline of Victor's fingers clearly visible against the guard's pale skin. Several women in the crowd gasped order. A businessman from Japan lowered his camera in shock. A young girl buried her face in her mother's coat, beginning to cry at the sudden violence. The elderly veteran surged forward as one their aged bodies temporarily forgotten as military instinct took over. For 3 heartbeats, absolute silence gripped the courtyard. The red mark on Collins's cheek seemed to burn brighter than a scarlet uniform as he slowly, deliberately turned his head to look directly at Victor, breaking protocol with a purpose and precision that made the movement seem more powerful than the statue-like stance he'd maintained before. Sir, his voice carried the quiet authority of battlefield command. You have just assaulted a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces while on active duty. The words fell like artillery shells into the stunned silence. Victor blinked momentarily, thrown by the calm, measured response where he'd expected either continued silence or an outburst. That's better. Victor attempted to recover, mistaking the guard's response for capitulation. Now, we could have a proper conversation about step back Immediately Collins continued, his voice unchanged, but somehow filling the courtyard, his eyes, which had been fixed forward for hours, now locked onto Victor's with sniper's precision. You are in violation of the Official Secrets Act Section 128 regarding interference with military personnel on official duty to Royal Military Police officers appeared, as if materialized from the stone itself, moving with coordinated efficiency that spoke of extensive training. Before Victor could formulate a response, they flanked him with professional neutrality. "This is absurd, Victor." SP buttered his face, flushing deeper. "Do you have any idea who I have meetings with? Parliament members in an hour." "You had meetings," Collins corrected his posture, now fully military, rather than ceremonial. "Your current appointment is with the Provost Marshal's office regarding assault on a service member, interference with ceremonial duties, and violation of protected boundaries." The elderly veteran and his companions had formed a loose perimeter of their presence. Wait to the sudden shift in power. Margaret stood frozen, her tablet forgotten in her hands, while Davis had retreated to the Bentley, his expression suggesting he was calculating how this would affect his future employment. "I'll have your commission for this," Victor threatened, his corporate intimidation tactics sounding hollow against the implacable reality of military protocol. "One call to your superiors, my commanding officer," Collins interrupted with precise clarity, "is Lieutenant General Harrison, who reports directly to the Defense Minister. You're welcome to contact him after the Provost Marshal processes your case." The military police officers moved with synchronized efficiency, one producing restraints while the other maintained careful positioning. Nothing in their bearing suggested anger or vindictiveness, only the mechanical precision of duty being performed exactly as trained. This uniform, Collins continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent courtyard, represents over 300 years of unbroken service. It is not a costume, Mr. Harrington. It is earned through combat deployments, rigorous training, and dedication to principles that exist beyond market valuations or quarterly profits. A small crowd of palace security and additional military personnel had arrived, forming a professional cordon that simultaneously contained the situation and shielded from casual observers. Before earning the right to stand here, Collins continued, his red handprint marked cheek somehow adding authority rather than diminishing. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. The medals you dismissed so casually, they represent actions under enemy fire, not corporate acquisitions." Victor's corporate mask had completely crumbled, revealing the uncertainty beneath. As the situation spiraled beyond his control, for perhaps the first time in decades, he found himself in a scenario his wealth couldn't immediately reshape. "The men and women wearing this uniform," Collins gestured his scarlet tunic, "have died defending the very freedoms that allow you to build your corporate empire. We stand watch not as decorations, Mr. Harrington, but as living reminders that some things duty honor country transcend financial statements and stock options." The military police had completed their preparations, one officer addressing Victor with clinical professionalism. "Sir, you're being detained pending formal charges. Please come with us immediately. This is outrageous." Victor struggled briefly against the officer's grip. "I'll have this entire operation shut down. My lawyers." "Will your lawyers?" The elderly veteran interrupted, stepping forward with the quiet authority of decades of service. "Will explain to you that assaulting a Queen's Guard is one of the most serious public offenses you could commit on British soil, not because of the ceremony or tradition you so casually dismissed, but because these men are active duty soldiers performing a sanctioned military function." Victor's eyes darted frantically between faces, searching for any sign of the difference he was accustomed to finding. Instead, he saw only the calm professionalism of people who recognize authority based on something beyond wealth, something his billions couldn't purchase. "Mr. Harrington," Collins said, his voice softening slightly, though losing none of it. "Authority, true power, isn't measured in market capitalization or corporate influence. It's found in service to something greater than oneself, a concept that money cannot buy and privilege cannot bestow." As the officers began leading Victor away, Collins called after him with one final observation. "The discipline you mocked, it wasn't weakness. Sir, it was strength you failed to recognize because it came in a form your balance sheets couldn't measure." Gone was a commanding presence that had dominated boardrooms and bent markets to his will. In its place walked a man confronting, perhaps for the first time, the limitations of his wealth and influence. This isn't no recall back, but the threat sounded hollow even his own. "My company supplies critical infrastructure to a nation that existed long before your technology and will continue long after." The elderly veteran finished for him, his voice carrying the weight of Historical perspective, something you might consider during your detention. Margaret approached the officers hesitantly. I should accompany him as his executive assistant. You may meet him at the provost marshal's office. One officer replied professionally. The charges will be processed formally. There, as Victor disappeared from view, escorted toward a military vehicle waiting beyond the tourist area, Staff Sergeant Collins squared his shoulders and resumed his post. The ceremonial stance returned. Seamlessly, though, in the eyes of the onlookers, it carried new meaning, not the rigid posture of a living statue, as Victor had mockingly called it, but the disciplined bearing of a warrior temporarily assigned to ceremonial duty. The red mark on his cheek was already fading, but the respect in the eyes of the gathered crowd had only intensified. Parents who had shielded their children from the confrontation now brought them forward, explaining in hushed tones about duty, respect, and the true meaning of the uniform. That's the difference between power and authority, the elderly veteran explained to a wide-eyed American tourist who had witnessed everything. Power can be purchased, authority must be earned. Davis hesitated by the Bentley, uncertain of his status now that his employer had been detained. Margaret approached him with newfound decisiveness. Contact the London office. She instructed to have legal and PR teams assemble immediately and inform the board there's been an incident throughout the courtyard. Tourists had resumed their photographs, but something had changed in their approach. Where before many had treated the guard as a photo opportunity, now they maintained a respectful distance, many offering small nods of acknowledgement as they passed. Staff Sergeant Collins stood at his post, eyes forward, posture perfect, exactly as he had before Victor Harrington's arrival. But those who looked closely might have noticed a subtle difference in his bearing, not pride exactly, but the quiet dignity of someone whose values have been tested in public and found unbreakable. What would you have done if you witnessed this confrontation between wealth and duty? Would you step forward, remain silent, or perhaps record the incident like many tourists did? If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about Royal Guards, and hit the bell icon to be notified of our latest upload. Share this with someone who appreciates the difference between power and authority, and check out our other Royal Guard stories appearing on your screen right now. Let us know in the comments, have you ever seen someone with status or wealth humbled when encountering something their money couldn't influence? Until next time, remember, some things in this world remain beyond price, and all the more valuable because of it.